Hello, I'm Ranger Laura, one of the park interpreters at Big Bend Ranch State Park. And today I'm coming to you from our Western Visitor Center at Fort Leaton State Historic Site, which is right outside of Presidio, Texas. Now, Big Bend Ranch State Park is my favorite state park in Texas, and it's actually pretty famous for a couple of reasons. The most obvious reason for a lot of people is that we protect over 315,000 acres of rugged Chihuahuan desert wilderness. We're the largest state park, and that draws visitors from all around who want to find adventure here, and they want to explore this really unique area that we call home, because our park lies in the borderlands of the United States along the US-Mexico border. In fact, the Rio Grande, which you can see in this image, is our southern boundary, which is pretty special. So we have people who come and want to look at the beauty of the landscape. We also have a lot of researchers and scientists who come to study our plant and animal populations, as well as our spring resources. But another reason that we're popular and famous as a state park is because we have very dark night skies. And those dark skies are what I want to focus on tonight as we talk about dark sky ecosystems. We're going to talk about the ecosystems in the state park, but we're also going to talk about how the dark sky and the night sky impact your ecosystems at home. I'm going to be asking you a couple of questions as we go through this presentation, so feel free to stop the video at any point and think about those questions that I ask you and then resume it again. I also want to let you know that all of the photos that are used in this presentation were actually taken inside Big Bend Ranch State Park. And so you'll get to see a little bit of the scenery of the place where I am blessed enough to work. So I hope you enjoy this presentation as we talk some about dark sky ecosystems. So before we get started really focusing on the night sky, I think it's important for us to remember that no matter where you're watching from, whether you're at home in Presidio, Texas, or Austin, Texas, or if you're watching from across the sea in Paris, France, one thing unites all of us, and that is that we all sleep under a night sky. Now, what do you think about when you hear the phrase night sky? What comes to mind? Well, for me, when I think about night sky, I of course think about stars. I think about the dark interstellar matter. I think about the moon. I think about planets sometimes when I can see planets in the night sky. And since I moved to West Texas, where we have very dark night skies, I also think about the Milky Way galaxy, because this is the first place I've ever lived that had dark enough skies for me to actually see that, which is really impressive. But one thing that I had never thought about before is that skies appear differently from different locations. In fact, you can just say that some night skies are darker than others. Now, the difference in darkness between one location and another is due to pollution. Did you know that? It's a special kind of pollution, and we'll discuss that a little bit more as we go on through the presentation. But what's really special about this place that I get to work is that Big Bend Ranch State Park is an international dark sky park, which means it is recognized internationally for having very little light pollution. Have you heard of light pollution before? Pause the video if you're comfortable and raise your hand, or just think to yourself if you've heard the phrase light pollution before I just said it. Now, if you have or have not heard of light pollution, I want you to take a second and think about what light pollution might be and what might cause it. So go ahead and take a minute to think about that as well. Now, when you're thinking about light pollution and what it might mean, an important thing for you to know is that the park rangers at Big Bend Ranch State Park and all the communities who surround us are working together to protect the night sky from light pollution, which is pretty special. And we'll talk more about what that means as we go on. I'm going to move me over to the corner now. But the important thing for you to remember is that dark skies are important and they're worth protecting. Why do you think that dark skies would be worth protecting and worth all the effort that park rangers and local citizens are putting in to protect our dark skies? Why do you think that dark skies matter? Well, for us, the dark skies matter for a couple of reasons. First of all, the night sky, as you can see from this photo taken at Closed Canyon at about 2 a.m. by Sherry Hunt, the night sky is beautiful. People come just to see all of the stars that are visible in Big Bend Ranch State Park. It gives them a sense of peace, and it's kind of like natural art. It's something you can gaze at and feel connected to something bigger than you. Sometimes if you lie there for a long time just gazing at the stars, you can start to feel very small. And it kind of gives you a new perspective on life, which is kind of cool. Another reason that we think dark skies are worth protecting is because dark night skies, where you can see lots of stars, are part of our heritage. You think about what you do when you get home from school or work, maybe to relax. You might go for a walk or read a book or watch TV, maybe play video games or get on the internet. But before technology, before we had Wi-Fi and video games, people were looking up at the night sky and they were finding shapes in the night sky that we call constellations, kind of like a big game of connect the dots. They would find a bunch of dots or stars in the night sky and they'd connect them to create shapes. And from those shapes, after they found them, they would start to develop stories about those shapes, stories that would teach life lessons and ethics and morals, stories of adventure. And the night sky was kind of like the original TV for people before technology. That's where they would gather to share their stories around a campfire. So we think that that heritage that you and I are connected to is important to protect. It's also important because for many years before GPS units were invented and even compasses, people used the night sky for navigation. Now I have this constellation in front of you, and you can see Polaris as the North Star was really important. That's one of our circumpolar stars, which stays in pretty much the same place throughout the year in the North sky. And so people, if they were traveling at night, instead of getting a GPS unit, which they may not have had, they would locate Polaris in the North sky and know that they could travel north. And there are other constellations that people used over centuries to find east and south and west. And so the night sky, besides just being entertaining, it guided people for thousands of years when they were trying to find their way through rugged landscapes. But what I really want to talk to you about today and the importance of the dark sky is that the dark skies at Big Bend Ranch State Park maintain ecosystem health for numerous species of plants and animals. So these beautiful night skies that we've been talking about and looking at pictures of are actually part of our ecosystems, and they are helping plants and animals stay alive, and they're actually helping you and I be healthy, whether we realize it or not. And we're going to explore the concept of dark sky ecosystems a little bit more. Now, before we do that, I want to go ahead and review. sorry. I want to go ahead and review what exactly an ecosystem is. So take a minute and think about this. What is an ecosystem? I'm going to move myself again while you're thinking about that. Well, an easy definition, we can get it to come up, there we go, is that an ecosystem is a community of living and non-living things in a specific environment. So this tells us that there can be multiple types of ecosystems depending on an environment. And so I have a picture here that is obviously a desert ecosystem. But something important to remember is that within our desert ecosystems at Big Bend Ranch State Park, you can have tons of tiny micro ecosystems. We can have micro communities where there are different plants and animals that are unique to a small area that is not look anything like this picture in front of us. And so there are a lot of different ecosystems. And when you're thinking about that, you can think about your yard or your apartment at home. You may have different plants and animals growing in your own backyard or off your balcony that are not found a mile down the street. And that makes ecosystems really cool. But before we go on, a good way to kind of explore the concept of ecosystem a little bit more is to think about food webs or food chains and the transfer of energy from organism to organism. So we can see a couple of examples of food webs and food chains in this picture. The first one that comes to my mind that I can see really easily is we've got this roadrunner here and he has just caught this lizard. He is going to eat that lizard, and the lizard is going to provide him with nutrients that's going to feed him and give him energy. Another example of the transfer of energy up a food web can be found, let's see, in this bat. He's a little bit harder to spot, but this bat might be flying and eating insects, and he's doing the same thing. He's hunting for nutrients that are going to give him energy, and that insect is going to be consumed by the bat and provide the bat with nutrients. Now, if the bat's not careful, he might be eaten by another predator, which could be a hawk up in the sky. So if the hawk then ate the bat who ate the insect, we get to see this really interesting transfer of energy and nutrients in this desert ecosystem. We also have ants down here. It looks like harvester ants that are going out finding nutrients. And so all of these animals, living organisms, are going out and they're looking for what they need to survive, and they're transferring energy throughout this food web. Now, when we're talking about the living part of an organism or an ecosystem, excuse me, we're talking about what we call the biotic component of an ecosystem. So biotic components of this ecosystem, this environment that we're looking at, is the living part of an ecosystem. And so some of the living things that we've talked about can be animals, which we spent most of our time on, but they can also be plants. So if you think about this ocotillo, which is a common desert shrub in the Chihuahuan Desert, it is getting its energy from the sun, and it's converting sunlight into sugar, which will be a nutrient for it. And so it's transferring energy as well. And what's really cool to me is that we have prickly pear in the back who are also photosynthesizing, using sunlight to get their energy and nutrients. And then we have this javelina in the background who's sneaking up to this prickly pear. And I don't know if you spent much time around prickly pear, but javelina love to eat prickly pear. They don't care about the spines at all. And so After converting energy from the sun, this prickly pear becomes energy for this javelina. And if we have any large predators, oh, I think I see a mountain lion over here, that javelina could become food for a larger predator like a mountain lion. So we have all these living components or biotic components in an ecosystem. What makes an ecosystem unique, though, is that there are also abiotic components when we're talking about an ecosystem. So unlike all the living things we talked about, like plants, animals, and fungi, an abiotic component of an ecosystem is a non-living part of an ecosystem. So take a minute and see if you can find anything in this picture that is non-living. I know that can be kind of a strange thing, a strange concept. So some of the things that are abiotic or non-living in this photo of a desert ecosystem are things like soil, rock, and sunlight. Those are all natural non-living components that are impacting the living components in this picture. So we talked about how sunlight is actually providing energy to our plants. Rocks play a role in an ecosystem too, because they can be habitat or a place to live for things like a western diamondback rattlesnake. And shrubs or soils can actually be habitat for tunneling species like our harvester ants or our kangaroo rats. So rocks and soils are providing habitat and cover or places to hide for many of our desert species. Can you think of any other non-living or abiotic components that would be important to a desert ecosystem that are not pictured here? I'm going to go ahead and share a couple. Air and water. I guess you could argue that air is pictured in the photo because it's invisible, but that's kind of tricky. But water is another crucial non-living component in our ecosystems. Living things need water to survive. So think about this. We're going to think about this concept of ecosystems as we move along this presentation. Just remember that an ecosystem is a community of living and non-living things in a specific environment. And if you want to be fancy and impress all your neighbors and friends, remember that a biotic component of an ecosystem is the living part of an ecosystem, and the abiotic component of an ecosystem is the non-living part of an ecosystem. I'm sure you're all doing very well. I hope you enjoyed that. I really like ecosystems. We're going to explore this idea a little bit more as I move myself across your screen. And something that I want to introduce you to is the concept that the night sky is a component of our ecosystems. Sunlight is often widely accepted as a component of our ecosystems because we know that plants photosynthesize and make energy or nutrients out of sunlight. But it's important for us to recognize that natural light in the night sky is also an abiotic or non-living component of our ecosystems. So looking at this photo, which was taken in Big Bend Ranch State Park, what sources of natural light in the night sky can you see? We mentioned a few of them earlier. So some of the sources that I see are, of course, stars. Looks like we have a few planets up here as well. And something that's not pictured, of course, is the moon. The moon goes through phases, and those phases, sometimes the lunar phases or the moon phases can impact natural processes in an ecosystem, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But we've got natural light provided by the night sky. And that natural light from the stars and the moon is important to both diurnal organisms, which are organisms that are active during the day, and it's also important to nocturnal organisms that are active during the night. So both diurnal and nocturnal animals have special adaptations for survival. And some of those adaptations are actually dependent upon whether those animals are surviving and hunting and moving around during the day as diurnal, or if they're hunting and active, moving around at night as nocturnal. A couple of examples of these adaptations based on whether they're nocturnal or diurnal species is like thinking about the eyes of a mountain lion. If you ever get to see a mountain lion, or if you look at pictures online of them or their skull, you'll notice that they have huge eyes. And the eyes of a mountain lion are adapted to see in the dark, and they are specialized to hunt prey in very dim light. And remember in our food web that hunting prey animals is how mountain lions receive the energy and nutrients to be sustainable and have a good population of individuals so that we can have mountain lions around in our ecosystem. Another example is that prey animals like desert cottontails or even jackrabbits, they're adapted to seek cover beneath shrubs and large plants so that predators like hawks or bobcats cannot easily hunt them. And once again, that is an adaptation that is influenced by the amount of light present when these animals are active, whether they're nocturnal or diurnal. And finally, something I think is really cool is that many species of cacti are adapted to complete photosynthesis at night. So the cacti actually complete photosynthesis by conserving energy and conserving water, protecting themselves from the harsh desert sun. So I hope from these examples, you can start to see that species of plants and animals are actually very much influenced by the amount of light that they're getting in the desert and in other habitats as well. Unfortunately for all of us, natural light from the moon, stars, and planets is not the only source of light in the night sky. So our dark skies are being polluted by artificial light. Have you heard of that phrase before, artificial light? So artificial light is defined as any light source that is produced by electrical means. And a good example of light pollution in our state park or just outside of it can be seen in this photo. Can you spot the light pollution on the horizon? So the glow on the horizon right here is light pollution that is caused by electrical lights that are located right outside of our park boundary. And light pollution is also known as the brightening of the night sky caused by street lights and other man-made sources. So think about that definition. It's really interesting, and I think it contrasts well with natural light. So we talked about natural night sky lighting being that from stars and moon and planets. Well, in contrast to that natural light that we've been talking about, we have artificial light that is man-made or related to electrical lighting. And that you can see the difference is right here. Unfortunately, artificial light pollutes the night sky, and it impacts natural processes among species in an ecosystem. So the artificial light that we have here, the light pollution, which is this big glow that we see on the horizon, it's not only not fun to look at when you have the rest of the sky filled with stars, But think about if you were the one living in this city, you wouldn't be able to see this magnificent view that is actually right above your head because all of these stars are drowned out by the powerful light of the city street lights where you live. And what's sad to me is not only how this looks, because it doesn't look very pretty compared with natural light, but that it does have a lot of negative effects on individual species and the natural processes in our ecosystem. So we're going to look at how light pollution and artificial light impact our ecosystems at Big Bend Ranch State Park and also where you live. So some of the cycles in our ecosystems that are very important to our species that are impacted by artificial light are things like migration. And you might remember that migration is the seasonal movement of animals from one region to another. But artificial light can also negatively impact just traveling for species. So a couple of examples of this are songbirds, like this indigo bunting that I just pulled up on the screen. So songbirds, like the indigo bunting, travel or migrate at night, and they actually guide or formulate their migration routes based on the constellations. And sometimes some species base their migration routes on the moon or lunar cycles. And so what's happening to songbirds is that when they are traveling from place to place, they are unfortunately being drawn into artificial lights from skyscrapers in major cities, and the songbirds are actually crashing into the windows, and they're actually dying when they are drawn into those windows. And so that the artificial light is actually really severely impacting our songbird populations. And another animal, the dung beetle, is also being negatively impacted by artificial light because something that researchers have just found out is that dung beetles, when they're removing their dung and pushing it off their path to their children, they are actually guiding those routes based on light from the Milky Way galaxy. So start thinking about what is happening to these species if they cannot see the Milky Way galaxy, or if they cannot see the lunar phases, or if they cannot see constellations. Their whole migration and traveling routes are being interrupted by artificial or man-made light. And one of the saddest examples that we don't have here in the desert, but we do have in Texas, is sea turtles. Sea turtles, when they hatch, instead of going out to the sea, if they're located near a major city, they're actually being drawn inland. And so people are having to work to volunteer to watch for sea turtles hatching to make sure they go out to the sea instead of inland into the city, because they think that they're seeing natural light and the sea turtles are actually being drawn to artificial light where they can go inland and die. So other natural ecosystem cycles that are being impacted negatively by artificial light are hunting strategies. And those are methods animals use to get their food and continue the flow of energy, which is crucial to our ecosystems. So I like to use the example of insects being drawn to lamps. If you've noticed in your yard or in your home, moths and other insects like to hang out around artificial light. But if you have that outside, you see a lot of moths and insects hanging out along a street light. You'll also notice that there are bats that are hunting those insects. And sometimes you'll even see an owl swoop to get a bat all around that artificial street light. And so artificial light is impacting and changing hunting strategies. It sometimes gives predators an unfair advantage. So our insect populations are being decimated. And over time, if you think of removing that nutrient or that potential for energy from our ecosystem, if you remove insect populations, you're going to impact all the higher level predators that are relying on insects for their energy. This also affects pollination. So as you remember, pollination is when birds, bats, insects, and other pollinators carry pollen between plants that fertilizes the plants and allows more plant communities and individuals to grow. And so if we're removing insects and we're removing bats from these ecosystems based on changed hunting strategies, those are going to start impacting our plant populations, and we're not going to have as many plants. And one thing that I'm concerned about is the yucca moth. Some of our plants, like the yuccas in the desert, they only have one specific pollinator. And so if we start removing these pollinators because we're changing hunting strategies of species with artificial light, we're going to impact the flow of energy through our ecosystems, and we're going to start seeing species disappear. And finally, we're interrupting circadian rhythm, which is something that impacts you and I as humans and also other species as well. Circadian rhythm is the internal process that allows animals to know the difference between day and night. So basically for you and I, who are diurnal critters, we see sunrise and we see bright sun and we say, it's time to be awake, it's time to be active. And at night, when it starts getting dark, we start getting sleepy and our body starts telling us it's time to sleep and rest. And this is how we're adapted, and this is how other species are adapted as well. So when we introduce artificial light, it interrupts our circadian rhythm, interrupts our wake and sleep patterns, and we don't sleep as well. So these are some common critters that we see in the park here, and I have labeled them for you. We've got the yucca moth that we just talked about. I'm going to move myself up a little bit so you can get a beautiful glimpse of the mountain lion that was photographed within our park boundary. But I want you to get the concept that the more of these species that we protect, the more biodiversity we will have in an ecosystem. And so a greater variety of species and genes means that an ecosystem will be able to overcome stresses like drought or disease, and even overcoming them, they'll be able to function in the midst of hardship when we as humans are putting all these external stresses on them. And because these species are all linked to each other and to their environment in an ecosystem, it's important that we as park rangers and you as students and individuals are taking care to protect each abiotic and biotic component of these ecosystems, because all of our actions do impact ecosystems either positively or negatively. And you and I can help sustain these ecosystems by putting less stress on them. And one of the ways that we can do that is by choosing to introduce less artificial light. So we've been talking about this a lot in this presentation, but the fact is that humans like you and me, we do pollute the dark skies with artificial light. We drown out the natural light of the moon and stars and planets with all these electric lights, which this is just a typical city scene that we snapped a photo of it. You can see all of this electric light is going straight up into the night sky. And so you can see there's not many stars available there. And as we said before, artificial light is any light source that is produced by electrical means. And what really concerns me is that this is a map of the light pollution in the United States that was taken from satellite imagery. You can see in the late 1950s, the United States was pretty dark. We didn't have a ton of electric light just in major metropolitan areas. We grew a little bit more in 1970s, but look at the change between the 1970s and 1997. Look at all of that light pollution. And the really sad thing to me is that this is what it's projected to look like in 2025. So if we look down at this legend down here, you can see that the areas of yellow, orange, and red, some of those places are going to be 9 to 27 times the natural brightness level, which means that fewer than 100 stars will be visible in these areas. And we're going to drastically change the way we view the night sky and also the night sky's impact in our ecosystems. The good news is that although it looks discouraging from what we've just seen, you and I actually can make a difference and stop polluting our dark skies and start protecting our ecosystems. There's a couple of ways we can do this, and they're all pretty simple. So these are things that I've started doing at my house. I only turn on a light where it's needed, especially at night. And so instead of having a lot of lights in my yard and around my house, I just take a flashlight with me if I need to go outside for something. And so I don't have lights on all the time at my house. And I don't have lights where I don't need them. Another thing you can do is make sure that if you do want light outside of your house, make sure that the light is pointing down. You can see this is kind of a funny cartoon. We've got this guy, and I've had a neighbor before that did this to me. He had a night light, and instead of pointing it down, he had it directly coming into my window, and it did mess up my sleep because remember, artificial light impacts your circadian rhythm. And so a good neighbor will be one who has a light on their house but decides to point it down. So if you think back to that photo we just saw of those city streetlights where all the light was just soaking into the night sky, you can make a difference by just pointing your lights at home down to the ground so that this light is not going up into the atmosphere like it is here. And this is a real life picture. I think this was taken in Alpine, Texas, of just good lighting. It's fine to have lights outside your house, but it's a good thing if the light is pointing down so that we don't get that glow on the horizon that we saw earlier. And if you want to be a superstar and really help our dark sky ecosystems, you can place all outdoor lights on a timer or motion detector. This is something you'd want your parents to do, but this is something I encourage you to talk to them about. You don't need to have lights on all the time, all night long. It's actually costing you a lot of money. If you feel like you have to have a light in a certain area, you can put it on a timer, and then whenever a critter or someone comes around your house, that light will come on, and it's not on all the time and adding to light pollution. So I want you to think back now about everything we've talked about in this presentation. And if you and I do not decide to make changes at our own houses and how we use light at night, how do you think light pollution could negatively impact this ecosystem over time? We talked about this a little bit earlier. The light pollution could reduce the number of individuals in our insect, plant, and bird populations, among other species. So if we're removing these sources of food like insects and birds and plants from pollination, if we remove these sources of energy, then species higher up the trophic levels or the food web are not going to be able to get nutrients. They are not going to be able to get that flow of energy. And eventually these species, these larger species and predators will start to suffer, and our whole ecosystem will be impacted. And that could reduce overall biodiversity among plants and animals. So if you want to learn more about what I've talked to you about a little bit today, I would encourage you to visit the International Dark Sky Association website for more information. I've got their website right here for you. If you're in West Texas, you can also head to the McDonald Observatory in Fort Davis to get some really cool tours and view the dark sky with the pros. They will show you things through their telescopes that you could have only dreamed of. And finally, you're more than welcome to visit me at Big Bend Ranch State Park for interpretive and educational programs, as well as astrophotography opportunities. And that's a fancy way of saying night sky photos like you saw in this presentation. You can also get more information on stargazing in the area. I'm going to give you a little exercise through your teacher that will help you stargaze and practice observations at home. This is our Big Bend Ranch State Park Dark Sky Survey, and you're going to complete this through your teacher. They'll tell you when they are due. So we're going to start having you follow up on some of the things you've learned in this presentation. We want you to think about what is light pollution. Look around your yard at the sources of natural and artificial light and see if you can find any species in your yard, any bats or insects that we talked about, and some of the different habitats that you have in your yard. And finally, I hope through this exercise and this presentation that you'll start seeing that there is a really important habitat, not only at Big Bend Ranch State Park, but in your own yards, at your balconies, wherever you live. There are species that are trying to survive, and a lot of things that you and I do as humans can negatively impact them, but we can also do things to make a difference for them, preserving their habitat and helping them maintain their natural cycles through their dark sky ecosystems. I've enjoyed talking to you today. I hope that you have enjoyed this presentation, and I hope it makes you curious to learn more about the night sky and the critters and habitat that live all around you. My name is Ranger Laura, and I hope you have a great day.